Hi and welcome back. Apologies that it's been so long. I had another project which took priority, but I'm back now. So let's continue with the build with the prop and the diff insulation. Now, before everybody goes mad and says it's not a boat, I'm referring to the propulsion shaft and not a propeller. Now that that's cleared up, one of the most feared tasks when building a Caterham is the diff insulation, and to be more precise is the alignment of the diff in the chassis, which is quite straightforward if you know what to do. So let's go through the manual. Now the installation for the prop shaft starts on page 110. The part required, the prop shaft, the tools, some grease. They provide two tips. The first, line the splines in the prop shaft to the gearbox. Second tip is grease prop if necessary. It'll have a grease nipple. Page 111 is a diagram showing you how to insert the prop into the gearbox. Page 112 is the instructions for the diff installation, the parts required, the differential, tools required, a 90mm spanner, 90mm socket, 10mm and an 8mm Allen key, additional person, and some Loctite, and a ratchet and an extension. They provide three tips. Start at the bottom right with the spanner and work your way around. Second tip, make sure the prop shaft is in first. The third tip, lower diff bolts may require more than one washer. Try to keep them even. Page 113 is a diagram of how to install the diff into the chassis, which has three additional inserts. The first insert at the top shows you that there shouldn't be a gap between the cradle and the chassis. The second insert shows you that you should use washers to space the diff out. The third insert shows you that once you've packed out the space with the washer, there should be no gaps between the cradle and the chassis. Now that's all they tell you to do when installing the differential. So let's get on to the video and see how I did it. So a good tip I got from reading Chris Collins' blog, Caterham Build in Detail, I'll put a link in the description, was to lift the diff into position using the engine hoist. And in order to do so, the front half or the boot floor had to be removed. You'll notice that I have an additional aluminium plate covering the plywood floor. This is only supplied if you ordered a roll cage when placing your order for your car. I believe this is one of the regulations for racing. I won't be racing my car, but I will be using it for track days. I also thought it would be a good idea to remove the boot cover to protect it during the installation of the diff and the roll cage. One thing to remember prior to installing the prop shaft is to remove the cable tie holding the end plug into the gearbox. Once removed, I gave the surrounding areas a quick wipe in case any oil had leaked out during the engine installation when it was tilted. Now I wasn't sure if the U-joints came pre-greased, so I thought it'd be easier to do this now while the prop shaft was still out the car. I did find that the shaft had been painted after it had been assembled and the grease nipples were covered in paint. The paint seemed to flake off quite easily, and I was concerned that the paint could possibly come off inside the grease gun and get injected into other joints. Although a bit tedious, I decided to remove the paint first. It was the first time using my grease gun. It took a while to pump the grease through. As you'll notice on the next joint, it didn't take much. So I think it's safe to say the joints do come pre-greased. I know the manual doesn't state this, but I decided to apply some grease to the splines and the outer shaft to assist with the installation. One thing to note, you can only install the prop shaft from the rear of the car while the diff is out. and although it is tight, it does fit through the narrow section of the tunnel with a little help. Some have reported that in doing so, it removes some of the paint. I was fortunate enough for this not to happen. Once through, it was a simple case of lining up the splines and pushing the shaft into the gearbox. Next up was to sort out the required bolts and washers for the diff. As some of you may not know, the chassis were designed for the Ford Sierra diffs, and those becoming scarce, Caterham had to find an alternative solution, which ended up being a BMW unit, which I believe is used in the 1 and 3 series cars. The problem they had is that the BMW diff is slightly smaller and has a different bolt pattern than the Sierra diff, and therefore requires a cradle. Now you must probably be wondering why they didn't just update the jig to accommodate the BMW diff. Well, the 620 models to date still use the Sierra diff. As per the manual, you need to use the washers to center the cradle in the chassis. I thought this would be a lot easier if the diff was removed from the cradle while doing so. My thinking was I could slide the cradle over to one side and easily work out an even number of washers top and bottom, which I would then be able to divide in half for each side. This did seem to work well, and I got close to the required spacing, but did require an additional thin washer each side for the lower 2 bolts. And although it does appear that I'm trying to fit an additional washer in, I was merely using a washer to push the other washers into place. With the bottom correctly aligned, I proceeded to repeat the process for the top bolt. I removed the lower 2 bolts, which allowed the cradle to slide more freely on the top bolt, and slid it over to one side. I then measured the gap with the washers and test fitted them, and I thought I was done. I thought it was best to remove the lower bolts to check if there was any play in the top bolt with the washers in place. You'll notice that I placed the smaller diameter washers facing the bushes. This is to prevent the washers coming into contact with the outer sleeve of the bush when flexing, as this could possibly cause vibrations to be transferred directly into the chassis. For some nagging reason, I wanted to double check the fitment, so I decided to fit the cradle with all the bolts and washers in place. After installing the lower bolts with the washers, I then realized that the top spacing wasn't even. I did try and pull the cradle over to the left, but the cradle sprung back to the original position, which confirmed that the spacing needed to be different, and I had to remeasure the washers again. Although they wouldn't be even on the top, I'd rather have this than to twist the rubber bushes, placing them under strain, which could possibly prevent them from absorbing any vibrations. Another thing you'll notice is that when you get the correct selection of washers, you should be able to wedge them in between the bush and the cradle, and they should just stay there without falling out. Measuring everything up again, I used 2 on the right and 4 on the left. So my initial reason for removing the diff out of the cradle was to paint it, as the standard BMW diff requires some machining for it to fit, and this leaves some bare metal exposed. In the end, I ended up painting the whole diff with POR 15, as all diffs tend to rust over time. The cradle is a tight fit and needs a little bit of persuasion when fitting back on. With a little bit of luck, I was able to line up the original torque markings on all the bolts. One thing I should point out, if you're going to remove your diff from the cradle, I would recommend torquing up the bolts once the diff is installed in the car. As I had mentioned before, I was going to hoist the diff into position using the engine hoist, and I did this by attaching a strap around the diff that would be fed through the boot. Now I wasn't too keen on having the diff hanging above my head while trying to fit the washers, so I decided to get the bolts in as quickly as possible. I would then remove them one by one and fit the washers. Because I was working in such a confined space, I found it easier to lift the diff by grabbing onto the chassis cross diagonal and using my forearm to push the diff up. However, in my haste, I forgot to put copper slip on the lower bolt the first time round. For the top bolt, I inserted another bolt of similar size from the other side, while I removed the original bolt. A trick I learned while doing this was to align the washers by spinning a screwdriver inside the bush prior to installing the bolt. This time I remembered the copper slip. One thing I didn't capture on film was installing the handbrake cable, and I'm not sure if this can be done after the diff has been installed, so it's best to do this first. So I was back to the lower bolts. I had to remove these again to apply the copper slip, which I'd missed the first time round. All there was left to do was to connect the prop shaft, just so it wouldn't chip the paint on the chassis. This is one of those tasks I'll come back to later once the brakes are connected. One thing to note, the limited slip diff versions, although the casing is a BMW unit, the diff itself is a Titan unit, and it is a serviceable item. The manufacturers, Titan, recommend overhauling the diff every 12 months or every race season. That's for a track or a race car, or every 10,000 miles for a road car. Now you must probably thinking that isn't very much, but if you look at the average miles these cars do over a year, it's going to take you a good few years to get to the 10,000 mile mark. I am planning on doing an episode about services in the future. So watch this space. So that's it for this episode. If you guys enjoyed watching, please like, subscribe, comment, let me know what you did like, what you don't like about the episodes, or if you have any questions or any ideas how to improve things, please put in the comments. I do read them all and I respond to them. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.